Hello. Welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof stream. Hopefully you're feeling good. Hopefully you're feeling better than me. I am a little under the weather. So hopefully you'll excuse me having to cough or something. No, I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. Just for the purposes of the stream, just so you know. Might have to take an occasional swig of... I have some water with me. But no, tonight should be a good stream. We have an interesting one tonight. This is an essay from a long time ago. This might be 100 years old, this essay. The work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility. This is like a very weird title, I think, for... I mean, it says a lot. It says, like, what it wants to be about, which kind of seems really specific, but then if you think about it for a second, like, actually, it's really broad. What's a work of art? Well, he says the work of art, das Kunstwerk, the work of art, meaning, like, the whole concept of the work of art. And then what's this age of technological reproducibility? Now. But also, really, since the 19th century. So it's a lot to cover in one essay. This is a very famous essay. It's an essay that's influenced quite a number of different academic fields. I've heard someone argue that the field of media studies basically exists because of this essay. I don't really think that's true, but I think it's an interesting thing to say, because you can kind of see a groundwork for a different kind of thinking about the work, like not just artwork, but how technology kind of appears in our lives. One thing that I really like about this essay, there's so much in it. It's really rich and deep, and hopefully, I don't know if we'll be able to get through it all tonight. We might. It's not so long, but it's very, very dense. One thing I really like about this essay is it helps you to kind of think about how the meanings of things might change without any individual person meaning that change. That would be an interesting question to explore in an essay, but I don't think you'd wind up saying it was the foundation or responsible for media studies, and at least in North America. Yeah. In North America, I mean, there's so many other reasons, like political, academic reasons, even other thinkers, if you just think about Marshall McLuhan and all the various kinds of media theorists that exist. I don't think that's true. But if you like made believe, be like, well, what if we had to pick one essay to kind of base all of this stuff out of? What could we put at the beginning? This might be one that you could put at the beginning, just because it really begins to think about media, what we would call media. Media is kind of a weird North American way of talking about this. It's not really what they would say. And there is a little bit of disagreement in different kinds of countries about this, about the word media. Some kind of German theorists have adopted the word media, which is an English word sort of from Latin, to talk about what they're doing now. And some German theorists are like, no, it's really bad. Don't do that. You're messing everything up. But it begins with this kind of thought about art and the work of art as something that might really change in its meaning without anybody in particular changing its meaning based on how it's produced. And one thing I did ahead of time, we're going to read a version of this that doesn't have these titles, but there are 19 sections in this essay. And so if you were in my class, you might have heard me kind of talking about what you should do when you start reading an essay is not read. You should just look around. Just kind of like throw it around a little bit. Look and see if there's section headings, things like that. Maybe Google it. Just kind of get a sense of what's going on before you just dive right in, right? Then it might be too much. You might not be prepared. We need like an appetizer for this. So I found this one. I was like, oh, I've never even seen this before, actually. Because I was going to say something like, what you should do in your head is title each of the sections. What should they be? So this is the cheat sheet. He did it for us. So this is kind of the layout of the essay. This is how weird it is going to be. So forward, this bit, he starts talking about Marx. You're like, what? Why is he talking about Marx? We'll talk about that. Then he says technological reproducibility, authenticity. That's of interest to a lot of people right now, I think. So this might be a little bit of a shocking take on authenticity here, because he's going to say something like, authenticity is gone, donezo. It's out. A lot of people are like, no, that's what I have. So how do we kind of make sense of our sense of authenticity in light of him saying 100 years ago that it was dead? Destruction of the aura. That sounds like a good like B movie. ritual and politics, cult value and exhibition value, photography, eternal value, photography and film as art, film and test performance. I would really love to know what the German is for that, for test performance, because I'm sure it's probably a little bit different, but we'll talk about that when we get to that section. The film actor, exhibition in front of a mass, the aspiration to be filmed, painter and cameraman, reception of paintings, Mickey Mouse, Dadaism, tactile and optical reception, aesthetics of war. So if you just read this, yeah, I mean, everything is here is right. Like, you read this and you're like, what would possibly hold all of this together? And one of the reasons I wanted to start with this is I wanted to give you a sense of something about this kind of genre of writing that can be really kind of difficult at first, which is it's broken into these fragments in some sense. And there's a tradition of criticism. It is actually specifically German tradition of criticism that writes in fragments. There were these two brothers called the Schlegel brothers, and they had this magazine called Athenaeum. They were kind of romantics, you might say, with a capital R. And they wrote a book called Critical Fragments. They were taking the idea of the fragment as something that's specifically useful for criticism. Why the fragment? I mean, it's probably enough for a whole separate stream just to talk about that. But the fragment being something like, it makes you, the someone who's looking at it, have to fill in something that's not there. You go and look at a ruin, it's different than going to look at a kind of complete building. When you look at a ruin, you have to kind of imagine something that doesn't exist. And one of the parts of kind of critical writing like this is it leaves a lot, even though it says a lot, everything is here, it also wants you to kind of fill things in. Well, now we have so much more to fill in because we're 100 years out and AI is here, et cetera, and Mickey Mouse has just gone into the public domain, part of it. Or, there's all these kind of weird things that we can fill in now. And that's one thing that might be useful about this style of writing. Another thing that might prepare you for this is that Benjamin, he'll start talking about Marx. Scary. Communism. And Benjamin was very interested in Marxism. I think you could describe him as a Marxist of a kind. And he was really interested in dialectical thinking. And dialectic is a really weird tradition, one that I really love. I really love dialectical thinking. It's like something I find like solace in it. It helps me like understand the world a little bit better. And Benjamin is here doing it in a really kind of strange and subtle way. But let's just say this about dialectical thinking. It comes from this idea that everything has a little bit of something it's not in it. Nothing is fully itself. You ever wake up one day and you're like, I just don't feel like myself. That's every day. Every day you're something that's a little bit more than you are. And that's true of everything else. So dialectical thinking takes this kind of gambit of saying, let's think things including what they aren't, including that part where they negate themselves. So Benjamin's going to be doing this kind of in the background of this essay. And part of what makes this weird list of things hold together is that dialectical sensibility that he has. For instance, one thing he's going to talk about, relatively early on, is this difference between the technology of magic and the technology of the machine. And he's going to say some kind of weird things about magic and machine all along. And you'll see here at the very end, the tactile and optical. That's going to be a theme actually all through this. And he's borrowing that from some other people, which maybe I'll mention. That things that are really close and things that are really far away. Artworks is something that you hold, something that you touch. He'll kind of layer these metaphors a lot. So he does dialectic in this kind of literary, subtle way that maybe sometimes makes you feel like he's just jumping around. One way you can maybe click into that a little bit more, if you're reading along with this, is you might look for those themes and say, okay, I hear that. Let me see where that comes up again. And that's it's like a way of listening to, if you're into classical music, maybe you're interested in classical music, you have to learn how to listen to it. It's like a sonata, you need to pick out that theme and then see when it comes back changed in a little bit of a different way. That's what he's going to be doing here. But you don't have to get all of it. The main thing I would say, you don't have to get all of this essay. When things are really good and rich, like I just made some pasta sauce for myself, and it was like, I put a little cream in it. I made it rich, nice and rich, because I'm sick and I can do what I want. And so it made it taste better. It's like, I don't want to eat all of this right now, It tasted really good to the point that I didn't want to keep eating it so much, which is what I need to do. So if you feel that kind of richness, you're like, whoa, it's kind of too much. That might be a good quality. That might be a quality he's going for. Okay, so that's a lot of preface before we kind of jump into this essay. And as always, you can kind of throw stuff in the sauce of pasta in the age of its nasal decongestion. I also learned today. I got, the universe has a sense of humor. I'm taking Dayquil, and like there was a Boston Globe had. Yeah, I could read the Boston Globe. What can I tell you? Boston Globe had a headline that was like, Dayquil actually doesn't have any decongestion. All these kind of major over-the-counter drugs actually don't have decongestant. It's just been proven by the FDA. So there you go. So that's what I have left. Oh, you read this story? Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Okay. All right. All that being said, here we go. Let's begin this kind of strange, fascinating essay by Walter Benjamin, or Walter Benjamin, whatever you want to call him is fine. I'm going to call him Benjamin. The work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility. So this is the preface, right? When Marx undertook his analysis of the capitalist mode of production, that mode was in its infancy. Okay, so we already got to stop. When was Marx doing this? He's doing this in the kind of middle of the 19th century, right? The 1848 revolutions are popping off, and Marx is like there thinking about it. Yeah, this is the kind of moment he's talking about. So when he writes Das Kapital, Capital, the big work, that's probably what Benjamin's thinking about. He's analyzing something that is kind of just beginning. Now, you might argue with that, be like, capitalism has a longer history back to the Renaissance. But he's like, this is the major kind of beginning of capitalism, is what Benjamin wants to argue. So he's seeing it kind of do its baby steps. Marx adopted an approach which gave his investigations prognostic value. Going back to the basic conditions of capitalist production, he presented them in a way which showed what could be expected of capitalism in the future. What could be expected, it emerged, was not only an increasingly harsh exploitation of the proletariat, that's the workers, but ultimately the creation of conditions which would make it possible for capitalism to abolish itself. And if you don't know what that means, you got to go read a little bit of Marx. What can I say? But that's kind of one of the basic kind of premises of Marxism, you might say. Since the transformation of the superstructure proceeds far more slowly than that of the base, it has taken more than a half century for the change in the conditions of production to be manifested in all areas of culture. So this idea of the difference between the superstructure and the base is an idea that comes out of Marxism. The base being kind of this is a simplification, but the base being like kind of the economic basis of production, the social relations of production. So things might change in the sense that like we get a new machine in a factory, or we get a kind of large labor union that kind of is forming. Things are changing there in the economic base, in the social and technological relations of production. How does that affect culture? Well, from a Marxist perspective, it always does, but slowly. It doesn't immediately appear as a cultural change. Things like that, right? So the fact that we can have fashion, you might think about it this way. People often talk about fast fashion. The fact that technological conditions have been created to produce huge quantities of clothing, and that for which there's a global market, means that I can wear this t-shirt that has a band logo on it, and people can make all sorts of fashion statement. And t-shirts can become kind of fashion, because there could be so many different versions of them. So that might be one way that, from a long kind of industrial process, gets created this kind of cultural meaning of cheap clothing that's expressive, fast fashion. So it's taken a long time, more than half a century, to kind of appear here. He's more than half a century away. That's how old he is. Only more than half a century. How this process has affected culture can only now be assessed, and these assessments must meet certain prognostic requirements. They do not, however, call for theses on the art of the proletariat after its seizure of power, and still less for any art of the classless society. So there he's kind of like going against a little bit maybe the Soviet art theorists at the time, were like, here, we're going to give you a theory of art. This is what it's going to happen when the prolet cult, that's one of the terms that they had for it, the prolet cult, the kind of like proletarian arts would emerge. He's like, that's maybe not actually what is going to help us understand what we need to do, this kind of maybe slightly propagandistic theory. They call for these theses defining the tendency of the development of art under the present conditions of production, not the future. The dialectic of these conditions of production is evident in the superstructure, no less than in the economy. Theses defining the developmental tendencies of art can therefore contribute to the political struggle in ways that it would be a mistake to underestimate. And today we might say the political struggle. Aren't there lots of different ones? Well, sure. That might be kind of part of the bias that Benjamin has from that Marxist perspective. This is all kind of one big struggle. But, maybe there's a reason to think about it that way. That might be useful. You're like, at protests, maybe you've been to protests, people will say, these struggles are united. Well, what if they really are? Even if people aren't conscious of them, in some way, there might be some kind of reason that they are united. So he says, they neutralize a number of traditional concepts, such as creativity and genius, eternal value and mystery, which used in an uncontrolled way, and controlling them is very difficult today, allow factual material to be manipulated in the interests of fascism. Seems kind of odd. What does creativity have to do with fascism? That doesn't seem fair. But that's kind of what the essay is setting out to get to. And he's not really going to get there all the way till the end of why that's going to be the case. In what follows, the concepts which are introduced into the theory of art differ from those now current, in that they are completely useless for the purposes of fascism. On the other hand, they are useful for the formulation of revolutionary demands in the politics of art. And so sometimes it'll put words in another language next to what you have. Usually what that means is it's translating the thing that you just read. So the politics of art is Kunstpolitik. Why do they do that? You're like, well, it's translated. Why do they do that? Sometimes it's to get, maybe if you have a little bit of knowledge of the language, it's to give you a sense of that there's a specificity here in the word that they weren't quite able to capture. That's usually what it means. There's something about this formulation that doesn't quite work in the target language. And they want you to know that in case you want to say something about this yourself. Maybe you're going to be a critic yourself. Okay, 2. So let's remind ourselves what 2 is. Technological reproducibility. Okay, cool. In principle, the work of art has always been reproducible. Objects made by humans could always be copied by humans. Replicas were made by pupils in practicing for their craft, by masters in disseminating their works, and finally by third parties in pursuit of profit. As people say, counterfeits always exist whenever there's a market. There were counterfeits all over the ancient world. I was recently reading an interesting piece about the history of Chinese art, Chinese painting in particular, where counterfeits were considered like an art unto themselves. It was kind of like really, to be able to get someone to accept a painting that was a counterfeit forgery, was seen as its own kind of high artistic merit that people enjoyed that were also artists. So, it doesn't always end up being kind of shady, even that. Having appeared intermittently in history, at widely spaced intervals, it is now being adopted with ever-increasing intensity. Graphic art was first made technologically reproducible by the woodcut, long before written language became reproducible by movable type. And here he is kind of Eurocentric, I would say, because of course movable type isn't the first invention of printing, but the woodblock printing that also existed in China, the woodcut, if you have to imagine, you're taking a block of wood and you're kind of carving things in it to do letters or pictures or whatever. And then the part that's standing up, you're going to put ink on it and then press it down. So it's really hard to produce fine detail in a woodcut because then you have these little tiny bits of wood sticking up that could easily break. So, people did get very good at doing kind of fine detailed woodcuts, but you had to be like a master technician to do that. A lot of woodcuts are pretty simple in their designs because of the material they're working out of. I do like the conversation about forgeries or the counterfeiter's dilemma. Yeah, it's really fascinating, the stuff about counterfeiters. I want to write an essay just about that. There's one I saw of a guy who had to paint his own counterfeit in a trial to prove that he wasn't a Nazi because he had sold a counterfeit painting to a Nazi. And they're like, no, it's a real Vermeer. And he was like, no, it's not. Let me show you. And the evidence was I'm going to paint a fake one here in the court, which is like, I don't even know what to make of that, but there's all sorts of weird paradoxes about counterfeiting and how it takes on value, which is actually really relevant to what Benjamin wants to talk about here. If you're in my class, we'll also watch the John Berger Ways of Seeing documentary, where he has this fantastic, fabulous 70s shirts with big lapels. And for Berger, that's going to be a huge part of it. How do these paintings come to be so valuable? How did some guy in Saudi Arabia purchase this apparent Leonardo da Vinci for what was it, $200 million? How does that even come about? And so he uses some of what Benjamin writes in this article to kind of do an argument about that, which is a pretty interesting documentary if you haven't seen it. It's not even really a documentary. It's its own kind of critical work of art, I would have to say. Okay, but they are only a special case, though an important one, of the phenomenon considered here from the perspective of world history. In the course of the Middle Ages, the woodcut was supplemented by engraving and etching, and then at the beginning of the 19th century by lithography. So what was the difference between woodcuts and etching? The woodcut, obviously working on wood. With the etching, you're working on usually a copper plate, at least at first, and you would put a kind of acid into it. So you would make some marks, put some wax over it, and then put acid onto it, which allowed you to get much, much finer detail. So you can see the difference of this if you're interested by looking at the works of Albrecht Dürer, who kind of at the beginning of his career was doing just woodcuts. And then the engraving technology appears, and he switches over to that. And you can see the difference. He was a great wood engraver, woodblock carver, but you can see the difference. It's very, very clear. And then lithography is on a stone. And it's even more detailed and even more precise, because there you're basically just using oil. You can use it like with an oil marker or something like that. And then the fact that oil and water separates means you just get the ink from that. So that meant rapid mass production in newspapers and major books could have these kind of highly detailed images in them that came with lithography, usually. So lithography marked a fundamentally new stage in the technology of reproduction. I told you. This much more direct process, distinguished by the fact that the drawing is traced on a stone rather than incised on a block of wood or etched on a copper plate, first made it possible for graphic art to market its products not only in large numbers as previously, but in daily changing variations. That goes along with the newspaper thing, as I was talking about. In Paris, there are these magazines that people like Daumier were writing, and they were comic magazines. Basically, the invention of comics, daily comic strips, couldn't have been possible without lithography. They didn't really begin as strips, but things like that, where you're constantly seeing new images every day, and you were buying these magazines in order to basically see the images. That's what people were really interested in. But only a few decades after the invention of lithography, graphic art was surpassed by photography. For the first time, photography freed the hand from the most important artistic tasks in the process of pictorial reproduction, tasks that now devolved upon the eye alone. So if you think about, we don't really even do this anymore, but if you have ever looked through the viewfinder of the camera, you're doing composition. I guess you're kind of moving it around on your hands. On an old-timey camera, you might not be using your hands at all. It might be on a tripod. You're just kind of composing it with your eye. Whereas before, composition was, this very detailed process that you'd have to do through sketching with your hands and things like that. So the hand is being removed from the artistic part of it. And since the eye perceives more swiftly than the hand can draw, the process of pictorial reproduction was enormously accelerated so that it could now keep pace with speech. Just as the illustrated newspaper virtually lay hidden within lithography, so the sound film was latent in photography. The technological The technological reproduction of sound, around 1900, technological reproduction of sound was tackled at the end of the last century. Around 1900, technological reproduction not only had reached a standard that permitted it to reproduce all known works of art, profoundly modifying their effect, but it also had captured a place of its own among the artistic processes. Engaging this standard, we would do well to study the impact which its two different manifestations, the reproduction of artworks and the art of film, are having on art in its traditional form. So it's interesting to say, why separate these out, the reproduction of artworks and the art of film? Well, on the one hand, taking a picture, I remember one of the weirdest experiences I ever had was at the Louvre in Paris. And I went there a lot when I was in Paris. I would go there, most days that I could, I would go there. And then the one thing that everyone wanted to see was the Mona Lisa, or they called La Joconde there. And you could never see it because it was always being surrounded by tourists. And it was like a little kind of tiny, and it's in a little glass case, always surrounded by tourists who were taking photographs of it every time. I was like, I don't even care. I don't need to see it. I wasn't that interested in it anyway, because I'd seen it a million times because it's been reproduced so many times. I was like, what is going on? Why? You literally cannot see this image because people are just taking photographs, bad photographs of it. What is up with that? So on the one hand, the reproduction of artworks has to do with, there's an original that's kind of losing its originality. With film, there's no original. You might be a Criterion Collection person, be like, oh yes, we got to get the original. But at this time, that's not how Benjamin is thinking of it. So film is going to kind of be, for him, one of the major changes in our relationship to art. He's really interested in film quite a lot. He's interested in all of these media, but film has a special place for him. Okay, number 3. What did he call it? Authenticity. I like writing like a little essay that just one of the sections is just called authenticity. Maybe that's why he took the titles out. He's like, it's too much. In even the most perfect reproduction, one thing is lacking: the here and now of the work of art. its unique existence in a particular place. It is this unique existence and nothing else that bears the mark of the history to which the work has been subject. This history includes changes to the physical structure of the work over time, together with any changes in ownership. So provenance, changes in ownership. What kind of marks does it have on it? Does it have kind of tarnish on the veneer? Are there kind of is there crackler on the painting, on the background of it? Those kinds of little things. Traces of the former can be detected only by chemical or physical analyses, which cannot be performed on a reproduction. While changes of ownership are part of a tradition, which can be traced only from the standpoint of the original in its present location. So, there is like EXIF data on digital photographs now. But how often have you looked at the EXIF data of a digital image? Also, you can just rip it off. So images kind of circulate. They come to us. We don't come to them. They come to us. The here and now of the original underlies the concept of its authenticity. And on the latter, in turn, is founded the idea of a tradition which has passed the object down as the same, identical thing to the present day. The whole sphere of authenticity eludes technological, and of course not only technological, reproduction. So here, this is like a really interesting moment because, I think, it's a really interesting moment because in some sense he uses a commonplace, being like, that's not original, that's a reproduction, that's derivative. That'd be something we just kind of say as a commonplace form of criticism. But Benjamin's changing a few things. On the one hand, you're going to see that that for him isn't a bad thing. He's excited about the fact that originality is dying. He's not a big fan of authenticity. And you might be kind of shocked by that at first. Be like, well, why wouldn't you want the authentic thing, the genuine article? Why wouldn't you want that? He's like, it has something to do with fascism for him. You're like, what? I don't understand. Okay, so hold on to that part of it. But the other part is that he's thinking, he just adds in this other idea, the sphere of authenticity, that the technological and the authentic are kind of at some remove from each other. And so he makes them into concepts and puts them next to each other. And it's funny, in my class, we've been thinking a lot about selfies, which is a weird for me. I would love to kind of think through this essay through the selfie. Because a lot of people, when we kind of first start thinking about the selfie, think about it as something that's more authentic, something that's more real than other forms of photography, which doesn't necessarily have to do in any obvious way with the technological means in which you take it. But then you think about a selfie and you're like, every part of it is about the technological production of it. People are like, if you can't see the hands in it, it's not a selfie. Self-portrait is not selfie. It's a different kind of thing. It needs to be kind of done like this with my hand. And it needs to be a still image. And it needs to have all these other kind of qualities to it. That there's this genre of the selfie. But part of it, I wonder, is if maybe that sense of authenticity that we get from the selfie comes from going kind of in another dialectical dimension. Now that we have so much photography, that photography is such ease, that authenticity again kind of emerges as a genre. Rather than about the moment of production. It's the quality of the production. How I produce this. I produce this casually, at a moment, from my own phone, self-consciously, for the purposes of circulation. That's what authenticity means. Okay, but that's changed the meaning of authenticity. If I'm consciously taking a photo, why is that more authentic than the candid photo, right? And so we have a kind of change through the means of which we're producing those photographs and the meaning of things like being real. Be real. It's 12:15, time to be real. But whereas the authentic work retains its full authority in the face of a reproduction made by hand, which it generally brands a forgery, this is not the case with technological reproduction. The reason is twofold. First, technological reproduction is more independent of the original than is manual reproduction. For example, in photography, it can bring out aspects of the original that are accessible only to the lens, which is adjustable and can easily change viewpoint, but not to the human eye. Or it can use certain processes, such as enlargement or slow motion, to record images which escape natural optics altogether. So if I'm kind of like, manually copying something, I'm going to be transcribing what the eye can see. But if I get a bunch of film and I slow it down, I might see things or hear things I wouldn't otherwise hear. This is the first reason. Second, technological reproduction can place the copy of the original in situations which the original itself cannot attain. Above all, it enables the original to meet the recipient halfway, whether in the form of a photograph or in that of a gramophone record. The cathedral leaves its site to be received in the studio of an art lover. The choral work performed in an auditorium or in the open air is enjoyed in a private room. So you might still kind of have the idea, but like, well, nothing really beats seeing the work of art in the place that it's meant to be shown. And if you might think about contemporary works of art, they might not work that well. They might not really belong in any place, but certainly, at Florence, the Duomo, that can't be anywhere else. That's a work of art. It's an architectural work of art. Il Duomo that has to be seen where it is, right? So you might have that kind of perspective on it. But think about all of the things you can do, like when people just think about memes. He doesn't know about memes. But you take a work, some kind of film work, and then you chop it up and you put it in lots of different contexts. Now it gets to be able to be circulated and take on meanings that the original never could. So a version of what we might be already really familiar with is what he's kind of talking about here. That benefit that we get, or that possibility at least, maybe not a benefit, that possibility you get from reproducibility, technological reproducibility. These changed circumstances may leave the artwork's other properties untouched, but they certainly devalue the here and now of the artwork. And although this can apply not only to the art, but say, to a landscape moving past the spectator in a film, in the work of art this process touches on a highly sensitive core, more vulnerable than that of any natural object. That core is its authenticity. The authenticity of a thing is the quintessence of all that is transmissible in it from its origin on, ranging from its physical duration to the historical testimony relating to it. Since the historical testimony is founded on the physical duration, the former too is jeopardized by reproduction, in which the physical duration plays no part. And what is really jeopardized when the historical testimony is affected is the authority of the object, the weight it derives from tradition. So you might think, that thing when you cut down a tree and you're like, you can count the rings? That the object itself kind of bears a trace of its own time, is part of it, right? So there's part of it which he's talking about, kind of like the chemical tests that you can do on the object. I can't do that on a reproduction, on an image of the object. I can't do any chemical tests. So it doesn't have that. But there's also the historical testimony, the kind of the story that goes along with it, the provenance of who has owned it. Well, there's all sorts of stories that go along with objects. Maybe if you have a family heirloom, that might be a place where the aura is still kind of attached. Sure, you can get an insurance policy on it, but you can never get that thing back. Because you can get a copy of your grandfather's watch that's identical in all the ways that you would be able to tell, but you know that it's not his. And so that testimony that belonged to that particular object, that tradition, is no longer with you. You can't really have it anymore in the same way. You don't feel that way, right? So that might seem kind of like a sad thing. That's a sad example. But again, for Benjamin, there's going to be some pretty large upsides to breaking things away from their traditions. It means that we can start new traditions or something like that. One might focus these aspects of the artwork in the concept of the aura and go on to say, what writers in the age of the technological reproducibility of the work of art, what withers, in the age of the technological reproducibility of the work of art is the latter's aura. Aura. I don't know how you should say it. I think I'd say aura. This process is symptomatic. Its significance extends far beyond the realm of art. It might be stated as a general formula that the technology of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the sphere of tradition. By replicating the work many times over, it substitutes a mass existence for a unique existence, and in permitting the reproduction to reach the recipient in his or her own situation, it actualizes that which is reproduced. These two processes led to a massive upheaval in the domain of objects handed down from the past, a shattering of tradition which is the reverse side of the present crisis and renewal of humanity. Both processes are intimately related to the mass movements of our day. Their most powerful agent is film. That's kind of a big jump, all of that. But let's keep going a little bit further. The social significance of film, even, and especially in its most positive form, is inconceivable without its destructive cathartic side, the liquidation of the value of tradition in the cultural heritage. This phenomenon is most apparent in the great historical films. It is assimilating ever more advanced positions in its spread. When Abel Gance fervently proclaimed in 1927, Shakespeare, Rembrandt, Beethoven will make films, all legends, all mythologies, and all myths, all the founders of religions, indeed all religions, await their celluloid resurrection, and the heroes are pressing at the gates. He was inviting the reader, no doubt, unawares, to witness a comprehensive liquidation. So he's making a little bit of a joke here. It's not like a laugh out loud joke, but the joke here is that this guy is kind of like excited. He's like, film is so great. We're going to have all the classics come back. All the classics will make movies again. Their celluloid resurrection. And for Benjamin, he's like, that kind of shows that it's not them. When, a bunch of different people are going to play Hamlet in a movie, and there's going to be all these different versions based on the kind of film that you have. But also the fact that, like, you can see it here or there, or now in your room or on your phone or whatever. That sense of it being Shakespeare, which has that kind of distance and remove of kind of classical tradition, that's gone. That's gone. It's not there anymore. And so this is part of what he means the social significance of film is like, it takes away that sense of the kind of mystique and grandeur of the great tradition of the past. And I think there's like a lot of, there's a way that some people kind of try to put this back into movies, and they're like, Renoir, Ozu, it's very special. They kind of have this like almost kind of sacred relationship to certain kinds of film. Usually it's art house film. Maybe some people kind of do it about the Avengers and stuff now. They're kind of like weirdly, they treat sacred as these like these like giant distributed global commodities. They're like, yes. This is the great work of our time. But it's kind of silly to do that. Like there is a kind of ridiculousness about them that I think most of us can kind of sense, right? Something kind of silly about that. Okay, number 4. Section 4. Just in the entire motive, this one's kind of wild. This is one that's like worth paying a little more attention to. Just as the entire mode of existence of human collectives changes over long historical periods, so too does their mode of perception. Just think about that for a second. We like to think, I'm pretty sure that most of the time when I'm looking around at stuff, I feel like it's just natural. It's just happening. I'm seeing what's out there. I'm hearing what's there. There's so much in the kind of selection of what we perceive, the interpretation of it, how it kind of affects our thoughts, that's very dependent upon a kind of historical conditions that we exist in. And it's hard to sense that because I haven't lived in any other historical period. So we need to kind of think it through a little bit and read about it. He's going to try to do a little bit of that here. I don't know if these are going to be the examples that are going to make it pop for you. Maybe we can try to find some of our own. The way in which human perception is organized, the medium in which it occurs, is conditioned not only by nature, eyes, ears, that kind of stuff, but by history. The era of the migration of peoples, an era which saw the rise of the late Roman art industry and the Vienna Genesis. So I'm just going to say something here about this. I said he's going to here at the end talk about tactile and optical reception. He's already here kind of thinking about it. So he's going to mention this guy, Alois Riegel. I don't know who this guy is, but Alois Riegel wrote a book called The Late Roman Art Industry. And he was an art historian and not particularly interested in, he wasn't like a political guy in the way that Benjamin is. But Benjamin was very aware of his work. And one of the things he talks about is, well, first of all, there's this industrial production of art happening in the late Roman Empire. It's happening at an industrial scale. And the kind of stuff that's being produced is probably not the stuff that people would think about when they think about great Roman art statues and things. They're little votive objects. They're kind of like weird little noses made out of wax and stuff. They're these weird kind of almost chintzy, maybe even kitschy objects from the ancient world. So a lot of traditional art historians who are kind of interested in the tradition ignored these things because they were like, this is second, third, maybe even fourth rate stuff. But for Riegel, he's like, that's not the way to look at it. What you want to look at is like, what's really going on? What are the conditions of production here? So you can see how that could be interesting to people for other reasons. And one of the things he talked about is you can see a difference in something that's being produced. Is it tactile? Is it haptic or optic? Is it meant to be approached very closely and even touched? That's the haptic side of things. Or is it meant to be seen from a distance? And so he uses this as a way of organizing, this whole kind of production of art. Developed not only an art different from that of antiquity, but also a different perception. The scholars of the Viennese school, Riegel and Vikhoff, resisting the weight of the classical tradition beneath which this art has been buried, were the first to think of using such art to draw conclusions about the organization of perception at the time the art was produced. So being like, okay, let's look at the artwork to see how people are seeing it. rather than let's look at this artwork and see what we see, because that's always the case. That maybe perception isn't natural, and you can kind of read out historical perception from the artworks itself. This might not even be that hard to do. Again, these examples might be, you'll be like, I don't know what to imagine. Just think about looking at like pictures of your mom from the 80s. Or whenever your mom might be from the 90s, I don't know. And like look at her clothes, like what were they thinking? What did they see with that crazy teased out hair and those purple stripes on their plastic jackets? What did they see? But maybe slowly you start to see what they saw in terms of the style. Okay, that's not exactly what Benjamin is talking about, but it might be a kind of clue to how to think about this idea of reading out a history of perception from the objects themselves. However far-reaching their insight, it was limited by the fact that these scholars were content to highlight the formal signature which characterized perception in late Roman times. They don't mean somebody individual's signature, they mean like the character of it, the way that it appears kind of regularly, the formula of it, basically. They did not attempt to show that the social upheavals manifested in these changes in perception, and perhaps could not have hoped to do so at that time. Today, the conditions for an analogous insight are more favorable, and if changes in the medium of present-day perception can be understood as a decay of the aura, it is possible to demonstrate the social determinants of that decay. Excuse me. What then is the aura? I like this. It's like you introduce a term, and then like maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs later, you start to define it. That's how you know you're at high-level theory. Yeah, you don't define right away. What then is the aura? A strange tissue of space and time. Okay, since I'm thinking about having a cold today, last time I read this, someone was thinking about tissue, and they said all sorts of brilliant things about the sentence, about the tissue, because they're like, you can see through it, and da-da-da. They're saying all these kind of brilliant things, which can happen sometimes even when you misread stuff. He's not thinking here about a Kleenex. It's still a little too early for Kleenex. He's thinking about tissue just as a sense of things that kind of go together. You could think, even like we have tissue in our body. A tissue, a kind of layering of things, kind of blending, a meshing of things together. Not necessarily a Kleenex. The unique apparition of a distance, however near it may be. So think about this. How can a distance appear? It's kind of a weird idea. It'd be like, aren't things just a certain distance from me? So let's start and think about a painting. Maybe think about a religious painting, or think about Christian art for a second. If you've ever seen Christian art, maybe you've seen stained glass windows in a church, or a painting of a crucifixion of Jesus, right? And imagine you are like a true believer of the religion. Maybe you are. And you're looking at this image. You're not looking at the image and being like, oh, that image is 2 feet away from me. It's like, that image is so far away from me in time. That happened. You might not be able to calculate how it happened in the olden times. And there it is. And I'm looking onto it. And it's, it might be 2 or 3 feet away from me, or a meter away from me for all of you non-Americans. But it's so distant from me, both kind of morally, ethically. I get the sense of it being far from me, right? That's what he's talking about. So the aura comes to the work of art for lots of different reasons. But that might be one more thing. What appears as a distance, a sense of distance in space and time. To follow with the eye, while resting on a summer afternoon, a mountain range on the horizon, or a branch that casts its shadow on the beholder, is to breathe the aura of those mountains, of that branch. It's a really nice idea. Maybe something to do on a warm day. In the light of this description, we can readily grasp the social basis of the aura's present decay. It rests on 2 circumstances, both linked to the increasing emergence of the masses and the growing intensity of their movements. And here he's referring to masses. You might be like, wow, referring to people as masses is not very nice. But this was par for the course at the time. and it does kind of refer to something specific, because it's like, it doesn't just mean large numbers of people. It's like masses. I don't know. Maybe I should have thought more about this before I went live, but I think what defines a mass differently, on one hand, is kind of mediatization, that there are many people reading newspapers, there are many people watching films, and so they all kind of can respond to the same thing, even if they've never met each other, right? But at a mass scale. And so it's a little bit different from just kind of like the people or a crowd. The masses are at population level, but with a meaningful sense of the population. Population kind of in itself understanding. I don't know. That might not be the best way to interpret it, but so, namely, the desire of the present day masses to get closer to things. The mass is such a new concept even in the 1950s, so it's great for you to point out how tough it is to get what he means here. Not quite the public, not a crowd, so what? Yeah, exactly. It's not the public, and it's not a crowd. It's not in one place or time, but it's not a public in the sense of like, we're all going to read the kind of text, and we're kind of like thinking about it together. I really think for Benjamin, the mass is really defined by film. By the fact that everyone can kind of see a film. The response that you might talk to your friends about the film, but like the fact that people can all see a film together across the country, across the world is like, that's for him a sense of the masses, you know. Not intellectuals, but not anti-intellectual. Not for him anyway. He wants to see a kind of transformation of the masses, not into intellectuals, but as kind of like, you know, Steve, you might be interested in this. There's a lot of stuff, I might write about this at some point, where like Bakhtin's sense of like laughter is like all throughout when Benjamin is talking about, you know, what would be good. One of the things he writes about radio, Benjamin has a radio show. And there was a book published a few years ago that collects some of the transcripts from his radio show over time, and it's translated into English. And there's a very, very brief piece in there about kind of his like reflections, his like theory of radio. It's like one page. And he's like, what would be, he's like, there's no real reason that it should be kind of, we have two-way radio. So this idea of like broadcast in one direction, he's like, okay, we've kind of already lost something. But what would be really good? Well, basically, for people to have a sense, like you turn on the radio and you like listen to a voice, you're like, oh yeah, that's the NPR voice. Like, oh yeah, that's the soccer announcer voice. That you should have this kind of catalog of like laughter about the different kinds of voices. That's the kind of enjoyment that you get from the radio, is that you're kind of cataloging these voices. I think that's great. I don't think that's what people do. But you know, that's kind of what he was trying to imagine of the intellectualization of the masses looks a lot like a kind of practice of laughter or something like that. And more, and some other things, but yeah, it is hard to, it's weird to think that the word like mass, you know, the aura would seem to be the hard word here, but actually I think aura, you can get the idea of it pretty fast. Some of the other words might seem more obvious and they're a little bit trickier. So anyway, the masses want to get closer to things. You know, they want to touch, want to feel. You might think about celebrity culture. People want to get autographs. Be like, oh, sign me. Or like, you know, people like, oh my God, I touched him, right? There's a way that there's like a relationship to maybe a religious idea or a cult idea there, but you don't want to kind of like stand far back away from it. You want to get close to it physically, really. Every day the urge grows stronger to get hold of an object at close range in an image, or better in a facsimile, a reproduction. And so again, here, why do we see build and abbild? Because you see a relationship between them that doesn't quite exist in English. Image and facsimile don't have the same root in them. And the reproduction, as offered by illustrated magazines and newsreels, differs unmistakably from the image. Uniqueness and permanence are as closely entwined in the latter as are transitoriness and repeatability in the former. The stripping of the veil from the object, the destruction of the aura, is the signature of a perception whose sense for all that is the same in the world has so increased that by means of reproduction it extracts sameness even from what is unique. Thus it is manifested in the field of perception what in the theoretical sphere is noticeable in the increasing significance of statistics. That's an extremely dense little bit there. Why statistics? Well, I mean, obviously statistics are super important right now for all of us. Even if you don't know anything about statistics, the fact that you can hear my voice right now, all of this technology is running on kind of the mechanization of statistics. That might be one thing. But also in the sciences and natural and social sciences, statistics are modeling a huge part of our world. And so he's seeing that in the same kind of, in like the subjective relationship to things that are being produced at scale, at mass. That there's a kind of statisticalization of our feelings about things. Having a feeling about a meme or even a film is a different kind of feeling than having a feeling about a specific object that cannot be reproduced. The alignment of reality with the masses and of the masses with reality is a process of immeasurable importance for both thinking and perception. Okay. 5. What did he say 5 was? Ritual and politics. I think I might try to get up to 9 or 10 today. I doubt I'm going to do the whole thing right now, but we'll see. The uniqueness of the work of art is identical to its embeddedness in the context of tradition. Of course, this tradition itself is thoroughly alive and extremely changeable. An ancient statue of Venus, for instance, existed in a traditional context for the Greeks, who made it an object of worship. That was different from the context in which it existed for medieval clerics, who viewed it as a sinister idol. Ah! Naked lady. But what was equally evident to both was its uniqueness. That is, its aura. Originally, the embeddedness of an artwork in the context of tradition found expression in a cult. And here, cult doesn't necessarily have a really negative meaning like it might now. If we refer to things, we're thinking about like, evil people in a cult or something like that. That's not what he means. It's a form of religious worship. As we know, the earliest artworks originated in the service of rituals. First magical, then religious. And it is highly significant that the artwork's erratic mode of existence is never entirely severed from its ritual function. In other words, the unique value of the authentic work of art always has its basis in ritual. So that's kind of a weird idea. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with it, with only that much being said. Because it's kind of a weird argument, being like, okay, well, just because I really like the original of something, that means that I'm partaking in a ritual? I don't really see that. I don't see why it's magical like that. And so that's what he's going to try to establish for the rest of this piece, the rest of this little fragment. This ritualistic basis, however mediated it may be, is still recognizable as secularized ritual. So even if you're not participating in like a church ritual or a synagogue ritual, if you're in the cult of authenticity, it's a ritual. It's just secularized. And even the most profane forms of the cult of beauty. The secular worship of beauty, which developed during the Renaissance and prevailed for 3 centuries, nearly displayed that ritualistic basis in its subsequent decline and in the first severe crisis which befell it. And you're like, okay, what is he referring to here? I don't know. He could be referring to a lot of things. and I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure exactly what he means when he talks about its subsequent decline. But you might think about, in the Renaissance, this guy Petrarch is writing poems to Laura, this woman that he loves, and he was going to like talk about her beauty and all these different kind of things wrote all these kind of sonnets about her, and then people painting images of kind of beautiful people that aren't necessarily religious or even mythological or kind of portraits, and then the development of that. Maybe he's thinking about that. What's the subsequent decline? He doesn't really tell us. So this is a place where, Benjamin's like really locked in his time to a sense of the world that's shared by his audience that we might not share. And sometimes that's just the case when you're reading stuff. And you don't have to feel bad if you don't really know what it's referring to. It's okay. You can just do what you can with what you have. For when, with the advent of the first truly revolutionary means of reproduction, namely photography, which emerged at the same time as socialism, it's a weird thing to say. Hi, okay. So that's a bot. I think 10 or 12 pages is great. You can stitch the videos all together with timestamps. Yeah, something like that. Maybe I'll upload them in 1 or 2 parts. I should probably work a little bit more in editing these videos, but I'm too lazy. Art felt that the approach of that crisis, which a century later has become unmistakable. It reacted with the doctrine of l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. That is, with a theology of art. Oh yeah, thanks, man. Also, this looks like it's 40 pages, I know, but it's like 20 pages of notes, so it's not quite as long as it looks. L'art pour l'art. This is in the 19th century. There are a lot of people going around, especially, I guess in France and Paris, being like, art for art's sake, we're going to defend it that way. And Benjamin, in lots of different pieces he writes, he kind of attacks this, what might be sometimes called aestheticism, people who have made kind of a religion out of art. He's like, it's really decadent. In fact, they call themselves decadents sometimes. But he calls it here a theology of art. This in turn gave rise to a negative theology in the form of an idea of pure art, which rejects not only any social function, but any definition in terms of representational content. Anything can be art. In poetry, Mallarmé was the first to adopt the standpoint. So the surrealists, the Dadaists, this kind of groups of people, who Benjamin was very invested in, he wrote a lot about them. They might be these kind of people that are trying to kind of separate art out from having anything other than itself to be concerned about. That's going to be a kind of religiosity, a ritualization of art, that art exists for its own sake. It's a cult of art. That's Benjamin's argument here. No investigation of the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility can overlook these connections. They lead to a crucial insight. For the first time in world history, technological reproducibility emancipates the work of art from its parasitic subservience to ritual. And you might be like, well, that's a little unfair to the history of art. And I think that there are ways in which, that's an overstatement on his part. But you might think about it this way. If you were producing art in the time before the camera existed, how are you going to make a living? Someone that needed to want that work of art. And a huge amount of time in the European context, this was in a specifically religious context, we are commissioning you to make an altar piece or something like that. But even in the times where it was, for a private collector, what did they want with it? What were they doing with those images? Why did they want those specific ones to be produced? You need to have much more cheap material to be able to just kind of produce on spec. That's what people say now. Freelancers and gig artists be like, I did this on spec. So today people will be on a Reddit. They'll be like, here's a photo. Can you get rid of my X in this photograph? And whoever does the best one, I'll tip. This is a common thing on subreddits. And then a bunch of artists, amazing Photoshop artists will come in and kind of do this. And they'll be like, oh, this is the best one. Here's $30. But a bunch of those people don't get paid. And they're doing it on spec, right? Well, in some sense, that's because there's, I don't know, maybe because the economy is bad and inflation's bad, I don't know. But also because there isn't not necessarily a cost other than your own time to doing that. If I have to do it with oil paints and stuff, there's so much money that goes into the production of some of these older works of art before mechanical reproducibility. You can't wait, or you can't just do that and hope somebody will buy it. You have to have a commission first. Okay, gross oversimplification, but that might be one way to think about what's going on there. To an ever-increasing degree, the work reproduced becomes the reproduction of a work designed for reproducibility. From a photographic plate, for example, one can make a number of prints. To ask for the authentic print makes no sense. But as soon as though it is funny, if you look at kind of classic copper plate engraving prints, they'll have a little mark in the corner, and then they'll have 2, and then they'll have 3 for certain kinds of pressings. So the further down the plate gets, it becomes more expensive if you have one that is only 1 notch because it was a first pressing, and then you have a third pressing. Well, it's they're basically identical with very small differences, but it's part of a way to make the art object more valuable as a commodity. So even early on, that was starting. As soon as the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applied to artistic production, the whole social function of art is revolutionized. Instead of being founded on ritual, it is based on a different practice, politics. So this is one of his weird arguments, which is that art is always kind of ritual or magical or religious, even in a secularized form. Think here, okay, given how weird the meaning of ritual was, and what he was talking about before, the meaning of the political might not be exactly what I'm thinking. It might not be like political posters, or it might not mean that kind of thing. He has a broader sense of the political, probably, given how broad his sense of the magical or ritual was. Okay, 6. Should we even look at this? Cult value and exhibition value. Art history might be seen as the working out of a tension between 2 polarities within the artwork itself, its course being determined by shifts in the balance between the 2. These 2 poles are the artwork's cult value and its exhibition value. So notice I said before about that dialectical kind of thing here. Here he's making it pretty clear. Whenever he talks about 2 poles, he's not gonna be the kind of guy that's like, okay, so it's kind of a 7 on the scale out of 10. It's more of a 3. It's closer to cult value. It's a little bit of exhibition value. He's going to be thinking about them in kind of a dialectical relationship. They're going to be kind of reflecting on each other all the time. It's not a Likert scale. Artistic production begins with figures in the service of magic. What is important for these figures is that they are present, not that they are seen. The elk depicted by the Stone Age man on the walls of the cave is an instrument of magic, and is exhibited to others only coincidentally. What matters is that the spirits see it. Cult value as such even tends to keep the artwork out of sight. Certain statues of gods are accessible only to the priest in the cella. Certain images of the Madonna remain covered nearly all year round. Certain sculptures on medieval cathedrals are not visible to the viewer at ground level. And I think that that's
something that might not kind of be apparent to you at first. When you're thinking about art, be like, art wouldn't be to be seen? Because let's say if I go to the MFA in Boston, which has this amazing Egyptian collection, all of which was stolen from tombs, which were not supposed to be opened or ever visible. So the idea of art being kind of for a public, here for a public, not a mass, art being for a public is a very modern idea. That's the exhibition value. So this cult value is this thing of the art. He says it makes something present. Some guy, another guy, his name is Hans Belting. He's a German kind of theorist of art. And he makes this kind of weird argument, but it is kind of persuasive once you read a bunch of it, that in art, every medium is originally a body. And so he says, like, the first works of art that we really have are the Jericho skulls. There's these skulls discovered at Jericho that have a kind of mask, plaster of something over these skulls. The attempt to kind of make the dead reappear. It's a human attempt to kind of deal with absence and loss, these kind of original artworks. And he kind of builds this whole theory to make you see how that's always still going on. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but you might think about it that way, of I want to make something present. I actually don't care if I see it. You might think of that myth, Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. For Orpheus to bring Eurydice back from the netherworld, from Hades, he had to not look at her. Once he looks, she goes back in. So the cult significance of art is not necessarily, even for visual art, visual, which might be weird to think about. With the emancipation of specific artistic practices from the service of ritual, the opportunities for exhibiting their products increase. It is easier to exhibit a portrait bust that can be sent here and there than to exhibit the statue of a divinity that has a fixed place in the interior of a temple. A panel painting can be exhibited more easily than the mosaic or fresco, which preceded it. And although a mass may have been no less suited to public presentation than a symphony, the symphony came into being at a time when the possibility of such presentation promised to be greater. So one thing you might think about, when you think about painting, you're probably thinking about paintings you've seen in a museum. They're almost always like on panel or something. You don't see a lot of frescoes. And if you're like, I love Italian Renaissance painting, frescoes might be the more common way that painting happened in the time. But then you have to go to some kind of palace, some palazzo in Florence or something to see it. You can't, break it off and pull it out. I mean, some people do, but, then you got to go wherever they moved it, right? So our sense of like what art is already kind of shaped by the possibility of what can be exhibited to a public. The scope for exhibiting the work of art has increased so enormously with the methods of technologically reproducing it that has happened in prehistoric times. A quantitative shift between the two poles of the artwork has led to a qualitative transformation in its nature. So like what art is changed by it being constantly exhibited. Just a weird thing to say, but I think it makes sense. Just as the work of art in prehistoric times, through the exclusive emphasis placed on its cult value, became first and foremost an instrument of magic, which only later came to be recognized as a work of art. So today, through the exclusive emphasis placed on its exhibition value, the work of art became a construct, Gebilde. See that word build keeps appearing? That's why it's here again in the German. With quite new functions. Build meaning a kind of image. Among these, the one we are conscious of, the artistic function, may subsequently be seen as incidental. This much is certain. Today, film is the most serviceable vehicle of this new understanding. Certain as well as the fact that the historical moment of this change is the function of art, a change which is most fully evident in the case of film, allows a direct comparison with the primeval era of art, not only from a methodological but also from a material point of view. Prehistoric art made use of certain fixed notations in the service of magical practice. I would love to know what he was thinking about when he wrote that line, because I don't know. But if you look at the caves of Lascaux, let's see if I can do this live. I don't actually know when these were discovered or know whether Benjamin would have known about these images or not. But you might kind of think that, I think they're really beautiful. Many people find these images really beautiful. They're very hard to see or light because, you can't just like put a giant light on them because you want to preserve them and stuff. So often they have to be kind of torch lit or things like that. or in special cases, they're being lit for special photographs to be taken. But they seem kind of like maybe they're being made, even though they're somewhat naturalistic, I would say, they're being produced for a certain kind of ritual. I don't know. I don't know what to make of this kind of part of what he's saying. In some cases, these notations probably comprise the actual performing of magical acts. The carving of an ancestral figure is itself such an act. In others, they gave instructions for such procedures. The ancestral figure demonstrates a ritual posture. And in still others, they provided objects for magical contemplation. Contemplation of an ancestral figure strengthens the occult powers of the beholder. The subjects for these notations were humans and their environment, which were depicted according to the requirements of a society whose technology existed only in fusion with ritual. Compared to that of the machine age, of course, this technology was undeveloped. So he's like, there's no way in a kind of ancient society for technology. He's not even thinking about ancient. He's thinking about really prehistoric societies. There's no way for any kind of process to exist without some kind of technological process, without some kind of magical or sacred meaning being attached to it. You're not like, oh, well, over here today I'm going to kind of sharpen my hand axe, but then later I'm going to go to church. The whole sense of life is kind of wrapped in that, including the kind of artistic productions. And that's where art is kind of coming out of. Is that kind of fast and loose anthropology? Maybe, but I would say, having read some more kind of contemporary anthropology of art stuff that exists, that's still pretty strongly the consensus, that there are ritual functions of early art in almost any case you can imagine, including today. It's not like it doesn't exist today. Probably still the majority of art that's produced today. Well, I don't know, majority. It's hard to say with reproducibility, but the majority of art cultures that exist today still have a religious function or some kind of sacred function to them, I would guess. But from a dialectical standpoint, this disparity is unimportant. So there's, magical, sacred technology and machine technology. He's like, sure, okay, machine technology, we have bombs. Magical technology didn't get as far, we have images. But don't think about the difference for right now. That's not what we're concerned with. Kind of a weird thing to say. What matters is the way the orientation and aims of that technology different from those of ours. Whereas the former made the maximum possible use of human beings, the latter reduces their use to a minimum. And here is this is a brilliant kind of weird sentence. The achievements of the first technology might be said to culminate in human sacrifice. We make the maximum use of human beings. We use all of the parts. We use the liver, the heart. Those of the second in the remote-controlled aircraft, which needs no human crew. I don't even know whether this existed yet. A remote-controlled aircraft that needed no human crew. That's a drone, right? And maybe one did that I'm not aware of in the period that Benjamin was writing. Or maybe I'm just being dense and not thinking of an obvious example. But think about the drone and the human sacrifice as these kind of two images that are in some relationship to each other. That's the kind of stuff that Benjamin likes to do. He wants us to think about these as kind of being somehow related in these kind of two extremes. The maximum use of human beings, the minimum use of human beings. Okay, where are we? The results of the first technology are valid once and for all. It deals with irreparable lapse or sacrificial death, which holds good for eternity. The results of the second are wholly provisional. It operates by means of experiments and endlessly varied test procedures. That's kind of a funny thing, too, being like, it holds for eternity. Be like, I don't believe in it. That doesn't matter. From the point of view of the technology, that doesn't matter. Who cares? Who cares whether you believe in it? The origin of the second technology lies at the point where, by an unconscious ruse, human beings first began to distance themselves from nature. It lies, in other words, in play. Which is a weird thing to say. But he keeps doing that. Seriousness and play, rigor and license, are mingled in every work of art, though in very different proportions. This implies that art is linked to both the second and the first technologies. It should be noted. Okay, let me actually go back to this thing. It lies, in other words, in play. You ever notice how kids' toys are always kind of like the technological advancement of one or two generations back, like trains or telephones that have things? Well, maybe now it's just like directly the cell phone. But we're always kind of playing with the technology of the just obsolesced form. That's what becomes the toy. Take that for what you will. Take it with a grain of salt, maybe. The first technology really sought to master nature, whereas the second aims rather at an interplay between nature and humanity. The primary social function of art today is to rehearse that interplay. This applies especially to film. The function of film is to train human beings in the apperceptions and reactions needed to deal with a vast apparatus whose role in their lives is expanding almost daily. So the function of film is to train people to understand it. What's the vast apparatus? Film itself. I think. You could say, okay, the vast apparatus, the ideological state apparatus. I don't think that's what he's talking about here. I think he's talking about film trains us to be in a film society. That's kind of what it's supposed to be doing. Why does he use this kind of weird word, apperception? So here I think he's thinking about a really weird distinction made by this guy Leibniz many years before this essay in the 17th century, where Leibniz distinguishes between perceptions and apperceptions. And for Leibniz, there's tons of things are perceptions. We perceive way more than we realize. I'm seeing more stuff than I'm aware I'm seeing. The stuff that I kind of grasp, that I take in as something, that's an apperception. And so, why might that be important for, let's say, developing a political consciousness? You watch a movie, you might be like, oh, that's a nice kind of scene between these two lovers. Maybe with a little bit more kind of training, you see something in that scene that's disturbing to you. Be like, it's not a scene between two lovers. This is gaslighting. This is gaslighting, which in fact was a film first, the film Gaslighting. So our ability to kind of take in a social reality, at a glance in one way, that film's ability to train us to do that is what Benjamin is very interested in this part of the essay. Dealing with this apparatus also teaches them that technology will release them from their enslavement to the powers of the apparatus only when humanity's whole constitution has adapted itself to the new productive forces which the second technology has set free. Okay, 8. Maybe I'll do 1 or 2 more here. We'll see how long this one is. Is that 8? No, that's 7. 7 is photography. In photography, exhibition value begins to drive back cult value on all fronts. So that cult value is what he was just talking about, the religious kind of value of something. Be like, not anymore. But cult value does not give way without resistance. It falls back to a last entrenchment, the human countenance. That means the face. It is no accident that the portrait is central to early photography. In the cult of remembrance of dead or absent loved ones, the cult value of the image finds its last refuge. In the fleeting expression of the human face, the aura beckons from early photographs for the last time. And Benjamin doesn't just mean this in a way where he's like, these people thought that these photographs... He loves these photographs. And if you're in my class and you realize how crazy it is that I assigned this and another reading from Benjamin, his short history of photography, and you happen to make it through both of these dense and difficult pieces, good for you, first of all. But there he talks about, how the face, it takes so long in the exposure for these old cameras that someone's kind of appearance, they take on a look. They're not reacting to something in the moment like in a film. It's taking minutes, and then he's like, their whole life condenses into their face. It's kind of a poetic thought. But I will say, if you look at some of these really old photographs, you do maybe sense a difference in how people look. Not their physical features, maybe there too. You're like, oh, maybe they need a little more iron in their diet or whatever. But in the way that they're kind of looking is different. In some sense, because they're naive about cameras. They don't really know what the camera is. Like they don't have a set of physical repertoires. Cheese, kawaii. They don't have any of that. But also, it just takes a long time. So they don't even get like their normal expressions. It's this other thing that only comes from this long kind of sitting before the camera. This is what gives them their melancholy and incomparable beauty. But as the human being withdraws from the photographic image, exhibition value for the first time shows its superiority to cult value. To have this To have given this development its local habitation constitutes the unique significance of Auger, who around 1900 took photographs of deserted Paris streets. It has justly been said that he photographed them like scenes of crimes. A crime scene, too, is deserted. It is photographed for the purposes of establishing evidence. With Auger, photographic records begin to be the evidence in the historical trial. Let's see if we can get kind of, just a sense of what these images look like. Would be a good one. Something like this. Yeah, maybe like that one. It's a really tiny thumbnail. It's terrible. Something like this. It's like, why is this being photographed? From the point of view of today, you might be like, oh yeah, it's a nice photo, but like at the time, you had to develop a way of seeing this. Be like, well, what am I looking at? Well, obviously I'm looking at Paris, but why? What's this for? What's this image supposed to do? Just be seen? You remember that moment as a kid when you were like, you got the toy and you're like, what does this one do? And they're like, oh, you just play with it. This is even beyond that. It's like, what's this for? It's just for you to see it. Yeah, that's the exhibition value. With Auger, blah, blah, blah. They demand a specific kind of reception. Free-floating contemplation is no longer appropriate to them. They unsettle the viewer. He feels challenged to find a particular way to approach them. At the same time, illustrated magazines begin to put up signposts for him. Whether these are right or wrong is irrelevant. So then the magazines come in and they have little captions. They're like saying saucy things, or they're kind of like being grand or whatever. It doesn't matter. For the first time, captions become obligatory, and it is clear that they have a character altogether different from the titles of paintings. So it's not the Visitation. It's not that kind of a title of this kind of classic scene. It's like, here you can see the kind of Boulevard Saint-Germain. It takes on a different meaning. The directives given by captions to those looking at images in illustrated magazines soon become even more precise and commanding in films, where the way each single image is understood seems prescribed by the sequence of all the preceding images. So it's weird. He's taking the idea of the caption of the magazine image and saying, okay, the caption is like an image that makes you read another one. It's just weird. You're like, well, it's text. Yeah. But first of all, silent films had text in them. They had the intertitles that would kind of come up in between scenes. But you can also kind of think about them as each, not really frame. We can't see at the level of frames, even in the older films. They had a fewer of them. But each kind of segment of the film is teaching you, one kind of scene is showing you how to look at the next one. Yeah. I just watched Evil Dead 2, which was fun. And there's one moment, he's going to talk more about this, the fact that there's kind of no place for the camera. The camera doesn't belong in one place. There's one moment where Ash, the main character, is going to go into this room in the house where the evil dead might be lurking. And so first you're on this side of the door, and then the door opens, and then you're on the other side of the door. But it's the sound, now the sound kind of the door kind of links together both scenes. You're not in any particular place. And the scenes are kind of, that is telling you to kind of see that they're on the other side of the door, they're about to come in. All that kind of stuff, that grammar of film, we're so familiar with it. And it's become so kind of formulaic that we don't think about it at all anymore. Until you watch some weird avant-garde film that's playing around with it, like some weird Jean-Luc Godard film. You're like, what? What is going on? Right? That kind of grammar of image was still obvious to Benjamin at this time. He's like, no, the film is making you see it in a certain way. Okay. All right, let's do one more. 8. Eternal value. Let's stop on eternal value. Why not? Yeah. I like when I get these auto what are they offering me here in the chat? Nuclear Man. Oh man, he can get me chatbots. He can get me more of this. Talk about reproducibility. Where's that fucking aura? Makes you miss the aura. Okay. Sorry. The Greeks had only 2 ways of technologically reproducing works of art: casting and stamping. Bronzes, terracottas, and coins were the only artworks they could produce in large numbers. And so this is what he's getting from Regal, the late Roman art industry, right? The interest in this kind of stuff, bronzes, terracottas, and coins. All others were unique and could not be technologically reproduced. That is why they had to be made for all eternity. The state of their technology compelled the Greeks to produce eternal values in their art. Think about that. I mean, think about how different that is from the kind of traditional view, which you'll still hear. Like really kind of silly, bad versions of it. People who have these kind of Greek statues or really Roman copies of Greek statues as their avatars on Twitter, and they're kind of like making some argument about white genocide or something like that. Why are they so interested in art? Well, for them, it's because of this eternal value of the art. They want to go back to that traditional way of thinking, that there's some kind of values that are always there, always for us. Not for you, whatever. But Benjamin is like making this kind of brilliant inversion, I think. Being like, no, the eternal values came from the primitiveness with which that they, of their technology. I have this marble block. There's only thing I can do is make one amazing work out of it. So I got to do it. There's nothing else. There's no other way to deal with this material. So that's where it's coming from. But that then became a kind of principle that you could see in other works of art. Horace in his odes. Horace is a Roman poet. He's coming, he's at the time of Augustine. Not Augustine. Octavian. Augustus Caesar. He's writing during that time of the empire. And at the end of his odes, his final ode, he says, "I've made a thing more lasting than bronze." And it's like, well, why would you want to be more why bronze, right? And we're like, come on, silver, gold. Why bronze? Well, it's because that idea of the eternal value then becomes ideological. And then gets reproduced even in places like writing, where there is some, not technological reproducibility, but manual reproducibility. You can copy the poem out into another version of the poem. To this they owe their preeminent position in art history, the standard for subsequent generations. It's a pretty good irony to be like, the primitiveness of their technology is why they become the standard. Pretty cool. Undoubtedly, our position lies at the opposite pole from that of the Greeks. Never before have artworks been technologically reproducible to such a degree and in such quantities as today. Film is the first art form whose artistic character is entirely determined by its reproducibility. It would be idle to compare this form in detail with Greek art. But on one precise point, such a comparison would be revealing. For film has been given crucial importance to a quality of artwork which would have been the last to find approval among the Greeks, which they would have dismissed as marginal. This quality is its capacity for improvement. I should probably improve this stream, but I'm just going to upload it directly. But I could improve it. I could edit it. The finished film is the exact antithesis of a work created at a single stroke. It is assembled from a very large number of images and image sequences that offer an array of choices to the editor. These images, moreover, can be improved in any desired way in the process leading from the initial take to the final cut. To produce A Woman of Paris, which is 3,000 meters long, Chaplin shot 125,000 meters of film. It's kind of funny to imagine measuring a film in length, literal length. But you could. Now with digital cameras, how many terabytes do you want? I don't know. It's different. The film is therefore the artwork most capable of improvement, and this capability is linked to its radical renunciation of eternal value. So you have release the Snyder cut, the director's cut, right? Like even when a film is kind of out, there might be multiple versions of it, multiple different kinds of edits of it. People might make their kind of a fan edit of a film. That kind of stuff happens all the time. With Blade Runner, people are constantly re-editing it. Be like, I've made my own edit. This is the edit that I think is the best. And people kind of like doing super cuts. We can take that as far as you want to go down the kind of internet rabbit hole of people improving or changing, altering what we still call film, kind of anachronistically now. It's not done on film almost ever. But film, video. I guess we do more call it video now, don't we? This is corroborated by the fact that for the Greeks, whose art depended on the production of eternal values, the pinnacle of all the arts was the form least capable of improvement, namely sculpture, whose products are literally all of a piece. In the age of the assembled artwork, the decline of sculpture is inevitable. Yeah, it's like, have you really... I've come to enjoy sculpture more in the last couple of years. But I did always kind of remember, like, when I first started going to art museums, I was just like, sculpture just does nothing for me. It leaves me cold. And I didn't know why. I couldn't quite place it. I was just like, it's too there. It's too much together. Like, I didn't have any way to kind of grasp into it. I didn't have any kind of sensibility for it. And maybe that's part of the reason why. It's like, it's done. It's not that interesting. One of the interesting things about kind of modern sculpture, if you think about someone like Rodin, Auguste Rodin, you know, who's probably much more popular than some, you know, more celebrated classical sculptors today, is he was looking at, one of the things he was looking at was Michelangelo's incomplete sculptures, his famous, his slaves that he was making for the tomb of Julius II. And it was seeing in that kind of quality of incompleteness an expressive possibility that was more interesting for sculpture than a kind of complete form. Because complete forms could be created in a different way. Could be seen maybe in other media at that point. I don't know. So I think I will stop it there, even though, I mean, it barely kind of cracked open the essay, having gotten through 8 of its sections, 8 out of 17, almost halfway through. But hopefully you enjoyed reading along with this. And hopefully this helped make more sense out of this if you're coming to this from my class, or maybe you're coming to this online from a class that you have, or maybe you're just interested in this kind of writing. But I will say, as I said at the beginning, these are kind of in fragments, and thinking again about the kind of incompleteness of it, this is chosen to kind of be in these kind of little fragments so that you do something. You fill in with your own thoughts, your own examples, your own sense of what's going on now. And that doesn't always mean agreement. And something that might be really kind of like a bad way to read, but might be a way that's very, very familiar way to read based on, you know, how you might be taught in school, is that in order to understand a text, you're supposed to kind of like, you're not supposed to even think about whether you agree or disagree with it. You're just supposed to kind of understand it first. And maybe, you know, years down the road, you could possibly have an opinion about it. I would say in order to understand a text like this, you have to, even before you understand it, try to come to a position. Be like, I don't really know what he means, but if he means this, I disagree. That means, okay, that gives me a way to read it. Could he possibly mean that? Let me keep going. See it that way. So give it a shot. If you're struggling with this, that's okay. This is a really dense work. It's tough. There's a lot going on in it. What you should leave with is something for yourself. You're not kind of trying to do service to it. You're trying to do something for yourself when you're reading this. So anyway, thanks for stopping by to the Rhetoric Prof stream. I'll be trying to finish this piece. I might even try to do this tomorrow. So I might come back tomorrow. I don't know what time because I'm bad at streaming. But hopefully I'll finish this tomorrow. And you can find this and part 2 on YouTube at the Rhetoric Prof channel on YouTube. So thanks very much. I'm going to raid another channel because I've never done that. All right. See ya. Oh, it won't let me do it. I'm not big enough. Bye.